This is the first draft of one essay in a series of essays that I'm writing as an accumulation of my ideas for what may or may not happen in a world where we've achieved artificial general intelligence or even artificial superintelligence. The focus of this essay is to discuss the forms of economic value that are likely to remain relevant as we move from artificial narrow intelligence, which is where we are right now, to AGI. This is not a prediction of when or how we will reach AGI, if at all. I'll leave that for a separate essay. The ideas I share in this essay rest upon the assumption that AGI will be reached, but I do not make any predictions for when, if at all, they will become highly relevant. However, I believe most of them will be applicable regardless of the pace at which AI advances, because one thing is clear. AI is getting better as time passes, and this trend will only continue. Thus, my goal with this essay is to stimulate productive discussions that can help us navigate advancements in artificial intelligence both safely and ethically. Please read the following disclaimers surrounding my intentions, my biases, and my conflicts of interest in sharing this essay publicly so that you can, as you should with anything you find online, take this with a grain of salt. First, this is all my personal opinion. It is not meant to be financial advice. It is not representative of Cresantis in any way, shape, or form, and my ideas are subject to change. Second, my academic work sits at the intersection of medicine, computational biology, and AI. Third, I am the founder of Cresantis, which is not a nonprofit, and I am sharing this essay via company channels. Fourth, I am a pragmatic optimist, and I tend to have a positive outlook of the future more often than not. Now, before we delve into the actual essay, I want to define some of the most common terms that will keep coming up. Artificial narrow intelligence, or ANI, is task-specific AI. AGI, or artificial general intelligence, is non-biological intelligence broadly comparable to human general cognition. ASI, or artificial superintelligence, is non-biological intelligence exceeding human capabilities on several dimensions. Economic value is the willingness to exchange resources for benefits. Social management refers to navigating irreducible human constraints in societal contexts. This essay ultimately argues that while many forms of human economic value may possibly erode under AGI, human participation in AI alignment solutions remains critical for long-term prosperity. Human beings currently produce economic value through four broad categories. 1. Physical strength. 2. Physical dexterity. 3. Cognition. And 4. Social management. These categories are intentionally both broad and vague. They are not meant to be perfect. They are simply lenses through which we can understand where human value comes from and where it may shift. Of these four, modern technology has already replaced physical strength by and large. Consider cranes, tractors, and other motor vehicles that are used to move heavy objects. The current economy is primarily knowledge-based, and organizations or businesses are essentially collections of systems. If you think about what makes a business a sellable asset, it's proven reproducibility of a certain level of economic value. Most investors, excluding venture capital firms, which are fundamentally making a different kind of bet, buy businesses when they're confident that the business will continue to generate increasing cash flow after the previous owner leaves. And the strongest evidence that an owner looking to sell their company can provide to investors that this will happen is to remove themselves from the business altogether and allow it to grow without their direct involvement. Accomplishing this requires standardization of every business function, such that the business is not reliant on any one person. The very best businesses can thrive regardless of who they employ. The most cost-effective and efficient way to accomplish standardization is to break each function down into specialized roles with defined inputs, outputs, and mechanisms for converting the inputs into outputs. For example, an HR department's primary inputs are prospective employees. The department's relevant mechanisms include the recruiting process, the onboarding process, the benefits and compliance process, and more. Consequently, the department's primary outputs are employees who are capable of succeeding in the organization. Since an entire business can be broken down into its functions, which can further be broken down into specialized roles, which can further be broken down into defined inputs, outputs, and mechanisms for conversion, that means every employee who works for a business engages in task-oriented cognition. I define task-oriented cognition as applying mental effort to follow a mechanism, namely SOPs, rules, and guidelines, to transform an input into an output. Comparing this definition to that of an algorithm, which is a set of rules that are followed in a process to solve a problem, you can see that they're both essentially the same, just worded differently. The output of task-oriented cognition is a favorable outcome or a solution that an organization can use. The output of an algorithm, if used ethically, is a favorable outcome or a solution that something or someone can use. In other words, an ideal business, an organization that operates at maximum efficiency, can be reduced all the way down to a collection of algorithms that achieve one cumulative outcome, which is a certain level of economic value. Yes, I agree that there are many roles in an organization that involve tacit knowledge, exception handling, and relational capital. However, just because something is implicit does not mean it cannot be taught in a structured manner. Consider nonverbal communication as an example. It's often regarded as an implicit skill that's best learned through personal experiences, over time becoming good at recognizing and utilizing nonverbal cues in one's interactions. However, as the entire executive coaching industry knows, communication, both verbal and nonverbal, can be systematically taught, measured, and improved. What was once tacit often becomes codified with enough scale, observation, and modeling, all of which can be described by a single term: data. AI follows the same trajectory with enough high-quality training data. Accordingly, it's unreasonable to think that artificial intelligence eventually cannot perform a task with defined inputs, outputs, and mechanisms better than a human can. Of course, these ideas are not based on today's AI capability. It's based on the direction of improvement. If AGI emerges, then plausibly, it matches human cognitive performance, it can be replicated millions of times at negligible marginal cost, it can operate 24/7, and it can continuously improve itself or its descendants. At that point, tasks based on structured cognition become economically exposed. Hence, for an employee whose job relies primarily on task-oriented cognition, if one of their tasks can be replaced with artificial intelligence, eventually all of them can, because a job or a role is mostly a collection of tasks. If a role can be replaced by AI, so can a department or a business function, because those are just collections of specialized roles. Finally, if entire business functions that once required human cognitive labor can be replaced by AI, then that allows for entire companies with no non-executive employees. Of course, such companies will still likely have one or more people at the helm who are legally liable for the business and decide which problems are actually worth solving, at least for the foreseeable future. This might not happen immediately, but it may happen quickly. As in, LLMs, agents, and other manifestations of artificial intelligence may not be quote-unquote good enough to carry out certain tasks with no supervision right now, but when AI becomes equally capable as humans, meaningfully cheaper, reliably scalable, and operationally defensible in legal and regulatory contexts, then replacement will speed up quickly. Historically, such transitions, even after their inflection points, often took decades to completely reinvent the economy. It took 80 years for electricity to become mainstream in the United States. And this may very well be the case with AI, where working with it is better than complete reliance for a long time, but it also may not. I expect AI adoption to be faster than previous comparable technological revolutions because we already have much of the infrastructure in place to adopt AI. For example, we already operate in a digital economy. We can provide value, consume value, and make financial transactions all through a single device. Unlike previous innovations where entirely new infrastructure had to be built, like roads for cars, the physical infrastructure of AI is primarily in data centers, which already exist and are being newly constructed at an alarming rate. Of course, this does not remove AI's physical limitations by any means, as data centers currently consume finite, non-renewable resources like metal. Furthermore, regulatory environments, liability structures, cultural preferences, and even institutional inertia present hurdles to widespread AI adoption. In the past, social structure often constrained technological adoption, even though the technology was ready for mainstream use. A famous example was the delay of the printing press for over 200 years in the Ottoman Empire to protect the calligraphy enterprise. A more modern-day example can be seen in our geopolitical and economic heterogeneity. As in, just because AI reaches a sufficient level of proficiency doesn't mean every nation, labor market, and/or culture will adopt it immediately. In fact, some countries might ban or restrict AGI altogether, similar to China banning all cryptocurrency-related activity at the time of this writing. However, I believe in the United States, such barriers will be overcome at a much faster pace than with previous technologies due to the military advantages of AI and the potential for nationalization in the race for global control. I'll save this entire discussion for a separate essay. Furthermore, seeing as the major assumption of this essay is that we will reach AGI, I will continue my line of reasoning presuming that task-oriented cognition performed by humans becomes economically outdated. Therefore, when displacement occurs at scale, people may fall into one or more broad paths in no particular order. 1. Social support, relying on welfare or community support systems. 2. Entrepreneurship, using the same tools that displaced former employees to create highly leveraged AI-first businesses, many of which will compete in a race to the bottom as AI becomes commoditized. 3. Investing. Older workers or those with enough assets may transition solely into capital allocation, which will remain relevant as long as capitalism in some way, shape, or form exists. 4. Reinvention. Shifting into more dexterous roles that are temporarily more resilient, like blue-collar trades, surgical specialties in medicine, culinary arts, etc. These categories are not exhaustive, and I would expect new categories of work to emerge. But in aggregate, the number of such newly created roles may not be enough to compensate for the scale of displacement in the short term, resulting in record high levels of unemployment. Moreover, the reason I say dexterous roles are temporarily more resilient is that the advent of AGI will likely solve existing and future bottlenecks in robotics, resulting in these roles eventually becoming machine dominant as well. I am not saying I know when robotics will replace dexterous labor. All I can say with confidence is that it will take longer than software-based cognitive replacement, as that is the primary bottleneck in developing generalizable robots. If we reach AGI or ASI, then such robotic advancements seem inevitable. All of that being said leaves us with a fourth broad pillar of human economic value, which I call social management. To reiterate, social management refers to forms of value created by navigating irreducible human constraints, like mortality, in societal contexts. The reason I consider such forms of value to be nearly unique to humans is that they exist to solve problems created by the fact that we are social creatures who live together. As such, social management can be divided into three primary elements: validation, connection, and trust. Each of these elements plays an important role in the way we as people coexist among one another. Accordingly, all of these elements have economic value. Validation refers to forms of value provided by the approval of others. This is the basis of all luxury brands, professional sports, theater, art, etc., because what they all primarily sell is status, often, although not always, motivated extrinsically. For example, there is no functional difference between a purse manufactured on a generic assembly line versus one that was handcrafted by a brand like Hermes, yet the latter costs 20 times more. Part of its value, beyond status, also stems from what it cost another person to create. Say the purse was hand-stitched by a world-renowned artisan and it took 100 hours of their time. Due to the finite human experience, the artisan's time, which the purse also represents, it is now a much rarer and therefore more valuable item, possibly a category of one. Yes, AI can generate content, as we see with AI influencers, but it cannot generate biographies, which are the stories of real people. That's why this example purse from Hermes will likely still have value in the future. Now, even if AGI creates a post-labor economy and there are minimal financial rewards for selling or gaining status, the desire for status will still persist because of its reproductive and non-financial benefits. We see this among nearly every species in the animal kingdom. The lion with the darkest mane, the wisdom of the elephant matriarch, and the dance of greater Lofarina are all examples of how animals acquire status for reproductive and social benefits. Humans are no different in this regard. So even if the mechanism for acquiring status changes, as it has over the centuries, the desire for status itself will persist. However, the entire economy cannot rely solely on status providers. Even now, luxury goods only account for single-digit GDP among countries like the United States, France, and Italy. Also, it is impossible for luxury goods to make up 100% of GDP in any economy because part of what grants status to such purchases is their scarcity. This brings us to connection, which refers to forms of value provided simply by the presence of other people. This has a greater capacity to be motivated intrinsically. Connection is the foundation of communities, peer advisory networks, and the like, which help foster meaningful relationships among people using a strong commonality as the spark. For example, being a principle of significant wealth. Connection is also the most emotionally driven of the three elements, which is what makes it so resilient to AI displacement. The lack of perceived structure, the myriad of biological and non-biological variables that we still don't completely understand, and the inconsistency of state that all contribute to human emotion make it incredibly complex and, therefore, extremely difficult to replicate. Even AGI will have a challenging time doing this because we ourselves are incapable of consistently controlling our own emotional temperaments. I am not saying it is impossible for AGI or ASI to replicate human emotion. In fact, I think they might do so if given enough time. What I am claiming is that even if AI manages to master human emotion, I still don't think it will entirely replace it because, according to most of today's evidence, we are biologically wired to value other people. Several studies have demonstrated that the quality of your relationships has just as much importance for your longevity as avoiding alcohol consumption and smoking. The value is not solely derived from human emotion itself, but from the fact that it is shared between real people. And yes, there have been studies conducted where emotional support chatbots and real human relationships were compared. As of this writing, the former cannot yet replicate the latter. Part of the reason is that relationships between people require compromise, which relationships with chatbots lack. You don't invest or risk nearly as much when engaging with a chatbot as you do in building a relationship with a real person, which is why the latter can be both more rewarding and more harmful. Still, the evidence is clear that being satisfied with one's community and relationships with loved ones are among the biggest predictors of human health and happiness. Thus, similar to status games, even if we lose financial incentives for fostering connection among others, I have a hard time imagining the value of that connection for human flourishing being eroded. Regardless, it's unlikely to support a global economy on its own. Suppose there are individuals who orchestrate local, circular economies that enable real community for billions of people around the world. It would still only employ a fraction of working age adults. Of course, even in today's economy, no single occupation supports all GDP, so I don't see this as a quote-unquote deal breaker per se. However, since we're bringing into question every occupation in the modern economy, we have to contemplate how we can offer employment to the majority of people. The reason is simple. If only a minority of people are employed and have economic agency, that is a recipe for mass conflict. As it stands, I personally cannot see a global economy supported solely by validation and connection, because both of them often require several others to participate for one person to become economically valuable. This brings us to the third element of social management, which is trust. It refers to forms of value that resolve uncertainty stemming from a lack of trust, whether that be in a person, an institution, an outcome, or anything in between. Human beings naturally fear uncertainty, likely because it often represented danger for our ancestors and we inherited that evolutionary caution. Accordingly, we value assurance, guarantees, predictability, consistency, and the like, because they all mitigate uncertainty. In fact, most of our economy is built around resolving uncertainty, especially in high-risk sectors like healthcare, finance, and law. For example, beyond the basic function of their jobs, physicians resolve two major forms of uncertainty. First, you experience uncertainty surrounding your health situation because you don't trust yourself enough to make the right choices. Physicians can clarify this uncertainty because they have more skills and information than you do, which are relevant to your situation. Second, you experience uncertainty surrounding the risk of medical errors because you lack trust in another person or institution having significant influence over your health. Physicians resolve this uncertainty by taking legal and moral accountability for their recommendations, which aligns one of their incentives, keeping their licenses, with your goals, becoming healthier. Yes, it's fair for you to think that this is my way of justifying the necessity of my medical career. However, I think the medical field is just as susceptible to displacement as any other high-risk sector, like finance and law. One of the main reasons I think such fields will still require people is because of the risk that such professionals take in terms of legal and ethical liability, not necessarily because of individual differences in competence. Interestingly, this accountability that physicians, financial advisors, and other such professionals absorb demonstrates why human societies have persisted for centuries despite our general distrust of one another. We all rely on a system of mutual accountability. Those of us who abide by the law do so, not necessarily because we're morally righteous, although I hope that's the case, but because we believe in the power of consequences enforced by the system. Additionally, these consequences often take resources from people being punished and distribute them to people who are wronged, which means punishing wrongdoers has an economic benefit for others, making it that much more powerful. Therefore, due to our shared belief and reliance on this system, we have an imperfect but stable society. Accordingly, mutual accountability serves as the foundation of our ability to work together, which has allowed us to achieve global dominance as a species despite our lack of strength, speed, and durability compared to other animals. Thus, trust is the most important element of social management and arguably the most economically resilient form of value for human flourishing. Without it, society would dissolve into anarchy. While I can't say to what extent governance, trust, and accountability will be transformed by artificial intelligence, blockchain technology, and the like, I can say with confidence that human beings will still be involved. Even if it is possible to achieve all forms of economic value based on trust using technology, like AI-only court systems, I still think people have to be involved to retain control. My confidence in making this claim stems from what scientists and economists refer to as the gorilla problem. In short, gorillas are faster, stronger, and more durable than humans, yet they live in zoos and we don't because we're more intelligent. In the context of AGI and ASI, by giving birth to superintelligence, we're effectively making ourselves the gorillas. To avoid getting trapped in the metaphorical zoo, we need to devise a means of ensuring our control over ASI systems, which will be smarter than us. And no, the analogy isn't perfect. Unlike gorillas, humans would be the creators of AGI. However, creation doesn't guarantee our control over AGI or ASI systems. This is the crux of the superalignment problem, and, unfortunately, we have yet to solve it. This is frightening to me given the pace at which AI is advancing, because if we don't solve superalignment, we risk humanity's survival. Therefore, I believe it is imperative that we construct scalable, human-centric superalignment infrastructure before we reach AGI. Infrastructure that enables human control of AGI and eventually ASI, maintains our system of mutual accountability, preserves economic agency for individuals who choose to participate, and enables our collective agency as a society. This might look like several layers of guardrails, liability structures, and people specializing in particular domains like medicine, cybersecurity, aerospace engineering, etc., all of which are coordinated to manage ASI systems. I am not sure how such fiduciaries would be trained, but they would likely develop domain-specific expertise in high-level systemic audits and boundary monitoring beyond technical execution. Much like we have governments today that ensure the public's alignment with national agendas, I can envision the possibility of a global human blockchain, a decentralized system of human oversight that ensures ASI's alignment with humanity. By no means is this the most efficient solution. In fact, choosing to use people when technology is a cheaper and faster option is the epitome of inefficiency. However, I see this as a price that we pay to ensure our control of ASI systems if this is the path we take. Of course, I cannot guarantee the exact timeline or manifestation of this infrastructure. My goal is not to present a definite roadmap, but to argue the necessity of a human governance layer for navigating advancements in AI both safely and ethically. Such a layer, populated by specialized human fiduciaries, when combined with forms of economic value derived from validation, connection, and new categories of work that emerge, gives me hope for our safety and economic future. I am intentionally avoiding commitment to a single constraint that justifies human involvement for continued superalignment of ASI systems, whether that be ontological, epistemic, political, or something else. My overarching claim is narrower and more conservative. I believe we need to retain human participation in alignment architectures as a hedge against the uncertainty of the future. My reasoning is that, at the very least, this gives us collective agency as a species to choose the direction we pursue. So regardless of your background, I invite you to engage with these ideas constructively, as productive discussions are the only way we can move forward together. Thank you for your time.